So let me say, or send a warm welcome to you, Bruce, and a warm welcome to everyone who is joining.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
It is my great pleasure. And I'll just say a few words about you. There would be many more, but I'll just open up with this to name that you are a co-originator of Coherence Therapy, a co-founder and a co-director of the Coherence Psychology Institute, and also a co-author of Unlocking the Emotional Brain, Memory Reconsolidation, and the Psychotherapy of Transformational Change, the Coherence Therapy Practice Manual Training Guide, as well as other 2 books and numerous peer-reviewed journal articles. And that ever since 2006, you have been driving the clinical field of understanding the memory reconciliation as a core process of transformation, therapeutical change. And that has a big impact in developing the application of brain research as a breakthrough for major advancements in the therapeutical effectiveness and unification. So this is quite a big topic we're having the pleasure to hear you on today. So thank you.
Well, yeah, I'm very glad to be here and share some of this remarkable body of knowledge. Yes.
Yeah. So we'll have you today, and I'll also name that on June 10th, you'll join us for a workshop on memory reconciliation and coherence therapy. So we'll have more of you on that setting. So for now, are you okay with us getting started, or is there something you would like to say before I invite something in particular?
No, I'm ready for your comments and questions. Let's let that pull out of me whatever I can offer. Okay.
So let's do that. I love that image. So, what do you find distinguishes coherence therapy from other trauma modalities? What would you share about that?
Okay, its distinguishing features. Mm-hmm. There are several. First, according to coherence therapy, as a rule, the cause of a given symptom is some emotional learning that is sitting there in emotional memory. So the symptom is ended by a process of unlearning. The methodology, therefore, consists of first finding and bringing into direct awareness that underlying emotional learning from outside of awareness, bringing it into awareness, the specific emotional learning generating the symptom that the client wants ended. And making that implicit emotional learning explicit always reveals that the symptom is in some compelling way emotionally necessary, adaptively, according to that underlying emotional learning. That is what we call symptom coherence. And so that's why it's called coherence therapy. And as soon as the symptom generating emotional learning is revealed and experienced and integrated by the client, then we guide the true unlearning of that material through the brain's innate process of true unlearning, which is the memory reconsolidation process. Now, that methodology is used in all cases, not only traumatic memory and PTSD cases. It applies in all cases. So actually, coherence therapy is not defined as a trauma therapy. Many symptoms arise from negative emotional learnings that were not formed in traumatic experiences. But coherence therapy is fully effective for traumatic memory and PTSD cases. Another distinguishing feature is the target of change.
Yeah.
The target of change in coherence therapy is that underlying mental model or schema that's driving symptom production coherently, not the problematic emotion or behavior or any other symptoms produced by that underlying emotional learning. Another distinguishing feature is the what we could call the standard of effectiveness in coherence therapy, which is transformational change. And that means the complete ending and the lasting disappearance of symptoms and their underlying distress. No ongoing effort or prevention is then needed to remain symptom-free once transformational change occurs. And such change, is not reliably achieved through emotional regulation techniques. Emotional regulation techniques typically only counteract symptoms, right? Symptoms get reduced only partially by building up a resources or a preferred state of mind or behavior. For example, building up relaxation techniques to reduce anxiety. Counteractive techniques like that, they require ongoing effort, right? And relapse is very common. In fact, relapse is actually very likely with such techniques. So there are no emotional regulation techniques used in coherence therapy because transformational change requires true unlearning through the memory reconsolidation process. And I think the last distinguishing feature I'll mention is that to carry out that unlearning, coherence therapy guides the therapist to create the same set of experiences that has been shown in laboratory neuroscience studies of memory reconsolidation, the same set of experiences that fully unlearn and eliminate an acquired emotional reaction. So that puts the methodology on very solid ground empirically. This isn't theoretical. It's the direct application of a well-defined, unique process that's been confirmed in dozens of laboratory-controlled studies, including over 20 studies with human subjects, showing such complete elimination of an emotional response. So, I think that's my establishing shot of what distinguishes coherence therapy. And I realize I haven't yet described coherence therapy's approach for complex trauma. So what do you think, Andreia? Should I add that on here?
Yeah. That sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And let's prepare all of this.
Good. All right, a quick sketch of coherence therapy and complex trauma. Well, in the therapy field, of course, it's well understood that complex trauma or complex attachment trauma is the result of parents or caregivers inflicting several different forms of intense suffering, right, as a regular part of family life. And the child gets little or no caring understanding or help for recovering emotionally from these ongoing ordeals. What coherence therapy points out and emphasizes is that in response to each different form of suffering, adaptive emotional learning occurs, creating a mental model or schema of the existence of that kind of suffering and what brings it on and how to try to avoid it. So in essence, that's a mental model of a problem and a solution. The problem is the danger of that particular suffering and one's vulnerability to it. And the solution is some urgent tactic for either avoiding that suffering or reducing its intensity somehow. For example, the learned problem could be, if I do anything that goes outside of mom's familiar world, she'll stop talking to me for days like I don't exist, and I've totally lost her love.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm putting into words what doesn't exist in words, in implicit memory, right? And the learned solution for that terrifying problem could be, so I must never do anything outside of what she expects me to be doing. Actually, a schema very similar to that emerged in a session with a woman who wanted help for her compulsive behavior of inaction on any new expansive pursuits that initially really grabbed her interest. And she was really puzzled and very troubled about that inaction, puzzled until she became aware of that underlying schema. And from outside of awareness, that schema was protectively stopping her from acting on her wider interests. Another example of an underlying schema is if I feel sad or hurt or scared, I'll be attacked and humiliated, so I've got to block my feelings. Again, that doesn't exist in words, in implicit memory, but we bring it into awareness and we, it's like an invisible person putting clothing on, and now you see the shape of what's there, right? So the verbalizing, the accurate verbalizing of these schemas brought into awareness is very important in coherence therapy. Not to make the process cognitive, but to enrich the direct experiential accessing of the schema. Another example of a schema is the only way to get any attention is to do something really bad. Now, in severe complex trauma, the client is found in coherence therapy to have many such schemas. Like I said, one for each type of suffering that they experienced. And there are many symptoms generated by those schemas, just like that woman's self-protective inaction. So, though complex trauma really is very complex indeed, as a rule, the therapeutic process in coherence therapy, to me, it seems that it self-organizes the work into specific symptoms and the mental model underlying each symptom. That the symptom actually serves as a portal for finding and accessing. And for each of the discovered symptom-generating schemas, we then guide the memory reconsolidation process of true unlearning. And the effect of that process is to drain all the realness and power out of the target schema, ending its production of the symptom. So, well, I think, that's my very simplified initial sketch of how coherence therapy views and applies to complex trauma.
Yeah, and I think you also, in that, also spoke to what can the memory reconsolidation bring into a long-lasting change in complex trauma, which is precisely that, right? There is complexity, but there's also the simplicity of the intervention that is effective.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not a cookie-cutter process. It takes, the process is well-defined. Our writings and trainings spell it out, very, very specifically. But it's a well-defined process that has to be applied uniquely to each client, right? Both to the client's specific schemas, which are always unique because each person has a unique emotional learning history, and also to the client's unique processing style, right? That's a general principle that any, highly effective therapist, I think, is very familiar with, that tailoring of the therapeutic process to each client. So that's fully, necessary here with this process too. But the therapist has very clear guidelines of what kinds of experiences are necessary to create so that the memory reconsolidation process takes place.
Yeah, and I wonder if you want to add to that. So you already named a few examples of schemas that can get people stuck in that particular adaptive strategy, I wonder if you want to unfold a little bit more on how memory reconsolidation allows the breakthrough in the process of healing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Well, memory reconsolidation it's the brain's built-in process for using new learning experiences to directly revise and update existing contents of memory, such as mental models and schemas. And it updates them at the level of their neural encoding. So it's profound updating. Now, neuroscientists describe memory reconsolidation as an experience-driven process of neurological change. So there's a certain set of experiences in awareness that triggers the brain to launch the memory reconsolidation process. Now, it's a master process in the sense that, excuse me, how the target memory is changed depends on the type of new learning experience that is created. So the target learning, in general, the target learning, and different laboratory studies demonstrate these different types of change. A learning can be increased in its intensity. It can be revised in its details. Or it can be profoundly unlearned, effectively erasing it from implicit memory. It's no longer triggerable by anything that used to trigger it. And that is the type of memory reconsolidation process that is most important for psychotherapy, for producing transformational change, the most effective type of change. So we want to create the type of new learning experience that drives a true unlearning through the memory reconsolidation process. And for unlearning, what's required is an experience that decisively disconfirms the target schema while that schema is reactivated. So in coherence therapy, that both at once experience of the target schema being reactivated into felt direct awareness and feeling, right alongside a decisive contradictory knowing that is unmistakably real to the client, not some positive thinking, not some good idea or preferred belief offered by the therapist, something that the client knows unmistakably as a contradictory knowing in relation to the target schema. And when the client is guided to be experiencing both at once, we call that a juxtaposition experience. And that juxtaposition experience is what unlearns and depotentiates the target schema and produces transformational change. Sometimes in moments right before your eyes in the session. So how is that as a sketch of the memory reconsolidation process?
Well, I'm biased, but to me it sounds wonderful. I wonder, do you have like a particular example of that you could share so that people have a better grasp of it?
Yeah, I could do that. I hope I can make it succinct enough. I tend to keep a particular example in mind for this kind of situation. It's an example that has enough of the complexity or true substance of the process, and yet isn't terribly long. Most examples are too long to fit into a 1-hour chat. But here we go. This is a man who came to see me because of a chronic problem of what we would call social anxiety, very extreme social anxiety. But he didn't call it that. He described it. Whenever he goes into a situation with other people, he basically freezes. His body becomes very tense. stiff, and he can barely think, and he can barely get himself to speak. So it's a kind of almost mutism driven by this freezing. So, well, I launched into the coherence therapy, process. With that description of the symptom, I have enough symptom identification, which is a crucial first step in coherence therapy, because what I'm going to be doing next is looking for, well, as I said earlier, using that symptom as the point of access, the portal for discovering experientially the underlying emotional learning that's driving that symptom. And that underlying emotional learning is linked to the symptom. So we're really going to move along that linkage from the symptom to that underlying material. So I asked him to bring to mind a recent good example of it happening. And that's a very important first step of the discovery phase, because in the situation where it's happening, that underlying schema is activated and most accessible, right, to be brought into awareness. So he described a situation. It was a co-worker's dinner party that he walked into, and there it happened. So I said, okay, there you are. I had him back in the scene in imagination. There you are. Just notice that tense tightness in your body. Okay? He nods. So what's the name of this kind of feeling? I asked him. What's the name of this kind of feeling? He couldn't answer that. So I asked him, well, is this a feeling of unsafety? Like something really bad could happen? And he said, yeah, it is. And there was surprise in his voice, which told me this isn't a person with a lot of emotional self-awareness, right? So, okay, that helped calibrate me on where to meet him, how to work with his process. So I said, okay, are you ready to find out what's not safe for you in this scene? And yeah, okay, let's do that. So I used a particular technique. I could have done it in several different ways. There's no one way to carry out the process. And we make a point in training in coherence therapy that the coherence therapy is not defined by particular techniques. We teach various techniques that are very useful to carry out its methodology, but it's defined by the methodology that I described earlier, not by any particular techniques to implement that methodology. So I chose a technique of sentence completion. And in this case, let's see, what I designed was, I said, I'm going to say half of a sentence, and then you say it without pre-thinking it, and just let your mind finish it according to the unsafety that's there for you in this situation. Okay, here's the sentence, first half. I better not talk freely to any people here, because if I did. So he said it mechanically. I better not talk freely to anybody here, because if I did. And he pauses, and then he says, what comes isn't words. It's this image of my father exploding in rage. Good. That's a good success of the technique from my point of view. And he then described the childhood in which that happened very often. Unexpected, intense blasts of rage and denigration and shaming from his big, narcissistic bully of a father, right? Over anything the father regarded as a mistake. Anything, such as, an arithmetic error or spilling some milk. And every time it happened, my client, who I call Gary for the sake of this example, as a boy, he'd be just stunned and frozen by this, scorching blast of rage and what felt like hatred and disgust from his father, right? And it often happened in front of visiting family members or friends, just unbearably shaming. And so I asked him, what did it mean to you? Oh, and he mentioned that no one ever came to his defense when it happened in front of people. So I asked him, what does that mean to you, that no one ever came to your defense? And he said what I expected him to say. So it was a Socratic question. I was deliberately eliciting something. He said, it meant Dad is right about me and everybody knows it. And I deserve it. So I said, okay, let's keep putting into words what it means to you and what you learned from that ordeal happening again and again. So right there's a significant teaching point regarding coherence therapy. This discovery, this accessing of what's underneath, is not only revealing what the client suffered, it reveals what the client suffered, but even more importantly for coherence therapy purposes, it reveals what the client learned from what the client suffered, which is different. Yeah. And what the client learned from what was suffered is that underlying mental model or schema that's going to be the target of change. So by the end of Gary's first session with my assistance, we had crafted words that he felt really captured what he learned from what he suffered. And here's the wording that he left with written down for him to stay with between sessions. Here it is. Dad is right to be that mad at me and scream at me. And everyone sees and agrees that I'm too stupid to be accepted or loved. So I'll always be shamed and rejected by people for saying or doing anything wrong. Saying anything around people is so dangerous. I've got to make sure I say nothing to stay safe. And now his freezing and his mutism was making sense to him in a whole new way, right?
Yeah.
And just notice how depathologizing this is, right? Clients come in thinking they're bad, sick, stupid, or crazy, right? Because of their presenting problem pattern or symptom. But this discovery process, by revealing the coherence of the underlying emotional learning and the emotional necessity, the adaptive emotional necessity of the symptom, that's very depathologizing, which is, of course, a therapeutic effect in itself already. But it's not yet transformational change. These words and this emotional truth, as we call it, still felt fully real to him. So this is now good discovery work in the first session. And this homework task of just daily reading and just staying in touch with the emotional truth that's verbalized on the card, that's an integration. That's the integration phase of coherence therapy that follows the discovery phase. We want this emotional learning to now be steadily present in ongoing awareness, which sets it up optimally as a target of change. So in the next session, first I checked with him whether he was able to read it, whether it was okay to stay in touch with, and whether it was now something he was steadily aware of. And his response showed me that it was. He did do the task. Now, it sometimes happens that the client doesn't do the task and that there's resistance to integration, even after the discovery work went well. And then that has to be addressed, and coherence therapy, orients the therapist for how to work with such resistance. But that's beyond what I can get into here. With the time
save that for later.
Yeah, much later. So after he confirmed that he was now in touch with this, the fact that he was now reasonably comfortably in touch with this, that was my signal to now move ahead into the transformation phase, right? The discovery phase and the integration phase are well enough done. Now I'm going to begin looking for how to carry out the transformation phase, which means heading toward creating that juxtaposition experience that I described earlier. And what that requires is finding contradictory knowledge that's real to him. So This is how I went about that with Gary. Now, again, there's many ways to go about that. And we set up therapists, practitioners of coherence therapy to be equipped with many ways to do it. This is how I did it with Gary. A very simple technique that we call the past opposite experiences technique for finding contradictory knowledge. I said, tell me something. Have you ever, he's a man in his mid to late 40s, right? So I'm pretty sure something like what I'm about to ask has happened in his experience. I said, have you ever visibly said or done something wrong, and the other person didn't react in an angry, rejecting way like Dad always did? So he kind of gazed into the middle distance for about 10 seconds and said, actually, yes, that has happened. And he describes a particular incident. And then another comes to mind. And then another comes to mind. And this is very typical. Once clients are consciously aware of the specific components or constructs or makeup of their symptom-generating schema, at least half of the time, for at least half of clients, when you ask them about whether they can recall a past opposite experience than what the schema expects and knows, yes, they can. These things happen, but they fly by, and the client never brings them into juxtaposition with the schema because, of course, the schema is far outside of awareness, and it's not possible. A juxtaposition doesn't happen. The memory of these incidents is in a separate memory network from the memory network where the schema lives, right? So all I'm going to do now is have him bring these into the same field of awareness. So after he named these incidents that came to mind, I then began to guide him into the juxtaposition by saying the following. I said, good. Now let's go over some things we know about your life experience of making mistakes. And it would be good if you could let yourself feel these things as we review them to whatever extent you can. On one side is all those many times when Dad became so angry and rejecting over something you said or did that was wrong, right? Yeah. And that was so stunning and scary and shaming for you. And because of all that, you've really expected that most everyone would also reject you harshly for any mistake, like Dad did. Like you were feeling at that dinner party recently. Can you feel that expectation again now on a body level, on a gut level? And, he nodded. So that is the reactivation of the target schema, right? That's a key piece of setting up the juxtaposition. And a key piece of what the laboratory studies demonstrate. So he nods, yes, I'm feeling it, good. So I continue. And on the other side, what you have actually experienced is all sorts of people who remain friendly and relaxed when they see that you've made a mistake. And now I repeat every one of the examples that he gave me. The store clerk was friendly and relaxed when you returned the book because you bought the wrong book. Your coworker was friendly and relaxed just last week about the mistake you made when you sent him the May figures when he had asked for the March figures. Your 12th grade teacher was friendly and relaxed about the mistake you made in the structure of the final paper. And, I pause after repeating each example a little bit like I'm doing here to let it register, to let this juxtaposition register a bit. Your college advisor was friendly and relaxed about your mistake over the materials he needed from you. All these people have been so different from Dad. Can you feel that? Right? And there is the juxtaposition experience, front and center. And, that first juxtaposition experience creates what the neuroscience researchers call prediction error, right? It's a prediction error experience. The target emotional learning is being confronted with his own experiences, unmistakably real, that tell his emotional learning and memory system, what I was expecting is not how the world actually behaves in the way I was expecting it. Prediction error. It's those first moments of prediction error that trigger the brain's memory reconsolidation process. The brain actually physically changes the neural encoding of the target schema very quickly. The target schema's neural encoding is neurochemically changed in a very complex manner. There's a lot of research on the specific molecules involved, very technical stuff, so that the encoding is now receptive to new learning that will revise the neural encoding at the neural level for about 5 hours. And then automatically the revised encoding recrystallizes back into stable form, which will persist forever until another prediction error experience unlocks it again for further revision. So you may read that every reactivation of any particular memory or learning launches the memory reconsolidation process. A lot of science journalism says that, and a lot of therapy literature says that. It's incorrect. Not every reactivation unlocks the target learning. A reactivation that faithfully reproduces what's expected without any prediction error does not unlock the learning, does not launch memory reconsolidation. Only if there's reactivation plus prediction error does the memory reconsolidation process begin. So, and that's what the juxtaposition experience does, obviously, right? So Gary nodded again when I asked him, can you feel that about all these contradictory knowings? And I then asked him, okay, what are you experiencing now from being in touch with both sides of this like that? And he said, with his eyes still closed, he said, I'm feeling sort of surprised and sort of relieved. Well, good. That indicates that this is registering experientially, as is crucial for it to do. And so far, so good. And now what I began was just 2 or 3 repetitions of the juxtaposition. And that also is what is done in the laboratory studies. The first contradictory knowing or contradictory experience that they creates the prediction error that unlocks the target learning, and then they repeat the contradictory experience several more times to drive the new learning that revises the target learning. So that's what we do. And we do it in a way, I do it in a way that's very naturalistic, doesn't look like a technique is happening. I simply empathetically review what's happened. And the client is very riveted on that review. This is fascinating to the client, amazing to the client. So my review is just soaked up fully. So I said to Gary, wow, Gary, all of your life, you've had that deep old expectation that most everyone will react harshly like Dad to any mistake. And yet here are all of your own observations, again and again, that most people don't react like Dad to a mistake you've made. And instead they stay friendly and relaxed. And with recognizing that, you're having this feeling of surprise and a feeling of relief. Now I'm quiet, but let that register. So that's the first deliberate repetition. And he says, yeah, that's right. So then, for another repetition, I said, well, would you like to get back in touch with this each day for a few seconds? This knowing that so many people aren't the same as Dad, even though you expected that they would be. So, simple words, empathetic review in such simple words, that's another repetition of the juxtaposition. And he said, sure, I would. So I said, good, then let's create another written set of words for exactly that. And here's what he left the session with. And I better wrap this up quickly here, I see. All my life, I've been expecting. So every reading of this, again, creates the juxtaposition experience. All my life, I've been expecting that if I say or do anything wrong, people will react to me like Dad, furious and disgusted with how stupid I am. And somehow I never noticed that people have always stayed friendly and relaxed and helpful when they see I've made a mistake. So different from Dad. Noticing that now is a surprise and a relief. Now, quickly, how it then went. He comes back in his next session and says, well, I have felt a change when I'm around people. I'm not freezing up like I used to, but his actual words were, it's not a walk in the park, he said. And he said, because, well, if everybody isn't like Dad, if most people aren't like that, now Dad looks really mean. Now I feel like I have this cruel father, and I've been pretty agitated about that. Well, yeah, that's what happens often, right? And I think any therapist experienced with complex trauma know what I'm talking about here. Stepping out of the emotional learnings that are the complex trauma steps right into recognizing this was mistreatment. This was abuse. And it's a very difficult, distressing revelation and recognition. And so Gary had to, we did several sessions processing his grief, his anger, his need for accountability from Dad, which he's never going to get, all of that. And after several sessions of that, he was largely resolved about that stuff. And I'll never forget the moment when he shook his head, and with a still a sorrowful voice, he said, "It wasn't me. I'm not stupid. It was him. He needed to see me as stupid so he could feel okay about himself." Well, that was music to my ears, because that meant he was on the other side of all this, and he was no longer freezing when he was among people. Now, this was complex trauma work on only one symptom. That was just one symptom. And it took about 8 sessions for him to resolve, to get free of that symptom and the underlying material. And usually in complex trauma, as I said earlier, there are many symptoms, many underlying schemas, and we do this process for each of those units. So like I said, the view in coherence therapy kind of self-organizes the work in this way. It's still very complex, especially when there's 2 or more symptoms and schemas in process at the same time, and you don't know which one's going to be the one you wind up working on in the current session. So you have to keep notes that keep you oriented and able to track all this stuff. It is very complex, but that's my initial sketch of an example of coherence therapy for complex trauma.
Yeah, and I personally love how you not only brought the example, but as you weaved in all the theoretical paradigm that sustains that, and much more than I would have asked for. So although I would have other questions, maybe we can transition to the participants' questions.
Good.
So feel free to leave something in the chat you would like to see answered. And we can start here with James. Hi, Bruce. Do you see a potential for a CT and MR to be able to be applied solo? That is, somebody guiding themselves through the three stages of memory reconciliation with techniques such as symptom deprivation, sentence completion, overstatement, etc. And with this, do you see the potential for MR to be made available to the masses, and why not?
Oh boy. Okay, right into that. In principle, yes. Someone with a lot of ego strength and well-developed self-awareness, emotional inner self-awareness, and great familiarity with the methodology and great familiarity with various techniques that are effective for carrying it out, yes, can do this. But that's very few people. Very few people. We've thought a lot over the years of writing a book for the masses, for lay people, but we haven't done it because we haven't figured out how to make it safe to do that. This process can drop somebody into material that's been outside of awareness, that's very intense and can be very destabilizing for some people, right? And if they're not accompanied by a skilled therapist, they could get in trouble, right? Imagine in the worst case type scenario, the most dangerous case, imagine somebody who's in a stage of addiction recovery and they're not stable yet, and they try to do this on themselves and they get in touch with stuff that destabilizes them and they plunge back into using. That's very possible. So we just don't feel it's responsible on our part to send this out there with that kind of risk. We haven't figured out how to solve that yet. We have a whole draft of a book that we put aside, even though the book said again and again in many places, call a therapist if this starts to feel too difficult. No, it's too risky. That's the answer.
Yeah.
But in principle, yes, you can do it on yourself. I've done it on myself, and I have colleagues who do too. Yeah.
There are a few others. Do you want to check out if there was one in particular you'd like to respond, or do you want me to read the next one?
I'll leave it to you to pick which seems most relevant from your point of view, please.
Well, I want to name they're all relevant.
That's why I didn't want to try.
I'll take that in. So I'll maybe go with the next one. Sean asks, can a similar result be achieved by identifying the person's implicit needs that may be driving the emotion and behavior, for instance, such as in nonviolent communication?
I couldn't find that one quickly, and I couldn't quite follow. Could you say it again for me, please? Sorry.
Yeah, I believe the question is around the implicit needs. If you would find that something similar could be obtained or achieved by nonviolent communication in
the implicit needs. Well, sometimes, certainly, but not as a rule. I don't think so. By the implicit need, I'm assuming what's meant is the underlying schema or mental model. Yeah, there is always some need involved in that. Now, let's see. In the case example I shared, what is Gary's implicit need? What? To not be raged at if he makes a small mistake? But, if you remember the beginning of that case example, Gary had no self-awareness of what's involved. He couldn't even say this is anxiety, right? I led him into that as the first steps of the work, that piece of awareness. So how could he possibly voice, hey, I'm returning this book and please don't get angry at me? So I don't think so as a rule. I don't think that's feasible for many people.
I would be that.
Nothing against nonviolent communication. I think it's a wonderful system for what it does.
There is a particular question. How long do you leave integration before juxtaposition?
Yeah, that's an important question because rushing too fast into trying to find contradictory knowledge is a mistake that many new practitioners make. One of our little mottos is slower is faster, right? Slower on integration. Make sure that the client really is experientially in touch with the revealed material, and make sure that the revealed material is complete enough. Has the discovery work been done thoroughly enough? And what that means is, from the therapist's subjective point of view, there is no mystery left about how the specific symptom is emotionally necessary to have. So the therapist uses that subjective criterion. You remind yourself of what the symptom is, which is necessary to do continuously, actually, as you carry out the discovery work, to keep looking for how that is emotionally necessary. Easy to lose track of that in the midst of complex material emerging. But, do I understand how this freezing, or how this compulsive inaction, or how this plunge into depression each time you visit your parents is emotionally necessary to have and fully makes sense to have in some adaptive, self-protective way? If there's any mystery left from your point of view as the therapist, that means more discovery work is needed to fully reveal what the underlying schema is made of. So slower is faster. Make sure it's thoroughly revealed, and then make sure it's thoroughly, stably in awareness for the client. And then begin to look for contradictory knowledge. When it's thoroughly enough revealed, the therapist examines the different components of the schema. Usually there are several pieces to it, and selects out which part of this seems to me most disconfirmable, right? With Gary, that was easy for me. He had a generalized expectation about all people. Everyone is ready to pounce on me with rage and shaming like that. Generalization constructs are very good to choose for disconfirmation because, as we saw in that example, life doesn't conform to any such generalization. The client will be able to find definite, decisive exceptions that become the contradictory knowledge. So that's what I chose there, is that generalization construct. So slower is better. Get real familiar with all parts of the schema. Make sure the client is feeling it. Then begin the transformation phase.
So while I fill the poll into all the other amazing questions that are in the chat, and as we are coming together for our closing time, maybe I'll just ask you to leave a little tease, like what can someone expect to learn or to hear in the follow-up of the time with you around coherence therapy in the big training?
Well, I'll address everything we've discussed here in more depth. How coherence therapy applies to trauma. There's a new book. Oh, yeah, thanks for pointing it out. There's a brand new book from Routledge. And we have a coherence therapy for trauma chapter in this book. Okay? There is also a section on coherence therapy for trauma in our main book, which is this. Also a Routledge book, okay? So there's plenty to read and study, whatever suits your learning style as the next steps. But yeah, in June, when I give my section of your complex trauma program, I'll be going into greater depth and showing video of a session doing the kind of work I described here today.
So let's save that as a teaser, videos and more of everything in greater depth. Yeah. So thank you, Bruce, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone who was here with us, participating in the chat and being present for this. We'll have a short break and we'll resume with Tracy straight after.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andreia. Thank you very much.